I was sent to Vietnam in in the beginning of April 1975. And like many of the reporters there, we thought that we would be there for quite a while. I mean, I thought my assignment would go on and on. This was at the time of the final offensive by the North Vietnamese Army, which was launched in March of 1975. And the NVA, as they were called, the NVA General Giap, had planned this final offensive to last 2 years. And in the event, it lasted just 6 weeks because the South Vietnamese army, known as the ARVN, just disintegrated. Under the Paris peace agreements of 1973, the Americans withdrew all combat troops from South Vietnam, and they also withdrew a lot of military support. So you had the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, having to do much more with much less. And at the same time, they were extremely demoralized. There was a very high desertion rate, a very high corruption rate among the officers. So it meant that the NVA, the North Vietnamese, just rolled southward in fact, I was hardly doing any combat stories. I was doing stories of flight, which was, the flight of hundreds of thousands of terrified South Vietnamese, fleeing before the advancing North Vietnamese army. And so that took us to, let's say, mid-April in 1975, where we had the last combat, which was in a town called Hoan Loc, where the South Vietnamese actually put up quite a fight and then gave in, surrendered 10 days later, which took us to around April 27th. And there you had a sort of firefight right at the gates of Saigon. And the North Vietnamese were by then right at the gates of the city. And there was a small little firefight between the South Vietnamese soldiers with air cover on one side of a bridge called Newport Bridge, which was just at the outskirts of the city, and a Viet Cong communist unit on the other side. And I was in a small group of reporters covering this. And I remember in my stand-up to camera, what's known as a stand-up, we decided that I better do it lying down, to stay out of this crossfire. I said that this was the closest that the communist forces had come to Saigon since the Tet Offensive of 1968. But, I still somehow didn't think that almost 36 hours later, there would be the order for the final evacuation by helicopter of all Americans and friendly South Vietnamese, out of the city by helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy and the Pittman building nearby. And that in what became the largest helicopter evacuation in history. The U.S. military evacuated almost 7,000 people in the space of 19 hours without a single loss of civilian life from the roof of 2 buildings. It was quite extraordinary. It was absolute pure pandemonium. The whole city was in a state of complete panic. The South Vietnamese were terrified that the North Vietnamese army would butcher them. And they were encouraged in this belief by the then U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, who said exactly that. The South Vietnamese will be butchered if North Vietnamese troops come into the city, if they take Saigon. So say they all converged, or most of them converged, many, an estimated 10,000, I think I saw, around the U.S. Embassy, which had these very high walls. They were about 14 feet high. And the order was, there was a very small contingent of Marines on the wall. And their orders were to haul the so-called round eyes, that is the Europeans, the Americans and some Europeans, to haul them up over the wall and to kick back the Vietnamese, or to hit them with the butts of their rifles. And the Marines were shell-shocked. I mean, they weren't trained to do this. But somehow, something like 5,800 South Vietnamese managed to get into the embassy or over the wall and got lifted up, put into a helicopter and taken to the aircraft carriers of the 7th Fleet. No selection process whatsoever. No, this was just pure panic. And in fact, in the days leading up to the fall of Saigon, those U.S. Personnel who were still in country, they were mainly embassy employees, USA people, CIA. They were spiriting their Vietnamese employees out of the country by fixed wing transport, as quickly as they could. And but once the North Vietnamese attacked the airport at Tan Son Nhut, the so-called Tan Son Nhut airport, that they could no longer take off by fixed wing, and so they had to turn to the evacuation by helicopter. What I saw, first of all, on the outside of the embassy wall, one of the things I saw was a man throwing his baby over the wall.
Wow.
I mean, and then the desperate attempted to. So desperate was he to get somebody, one of his people, out of the country. And as I was hauled over the wall, the first thing I saw was an embassy staffer hurling hundreds of thousands of dollars into an oil drum, which was burning. So, of course, my first reaction was, what are you doing? You're burning money. And she said, what do you want us to do? Leave it to the Viet Cong? And she hurled another $100,000 into this burning oil drum. I mean, it was quite surreal. Quite surreal. My first foreign assignment was the Portuguese Revolution, which became known as the Carnation Revolution, because the demonstrators were putting carnations in the rifles of the soldiers. It was an almost bloodless revolution. Only 10 people died, and that was all accidental. But that was a revolution. I mean, you knew it was one of the biggest stories of the decade. Maybe even of the second half of the 20th century. No, it was a huge, huge story. But it was so fast, Kate. It just happened so quickly. Everything happened so quickly. I don't think any of the reporters there imagined that Saigon would fall that quickly, and that they would also end up with this final option for evacuation of the Americans and friendly Vietnamese, which was the evacuation by helicopter. And why wasn't that option? It was because the then ambassador, Graham Martin, was in a state of denial. He thought that there could be some kind of negotiation, a coalition, some kind of coalition government formed between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. I mean, he was in complete denial of what was happening, and therefore he didn't allow evacuation plans. People were doing it. His embassy staffers and others were sort of spiriting out their Vietnamese employees and friends behind his back. I mean, his view was what one great reporter called Phil Caputo, who became a best-selling author. He called it the Great American Denial Machine. So wow. Yes, it was a huge story. Of course, I realized it was an enormous story. And I just was kind of sorry it went by so quickly. Well, what we saw was helicopters landing. I mean, they were landing at the rate of the U.S. helicopters probably landing at the rate of one every 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, it's one after the other, and unloading its passengers and then taking off again. But at the same time, you had the officers of the South Vietnamese army fleeing with their families in helicopters, U.S. helicopters, and they would come out to the South China Sea, to the U.S. aircraft carriers, and just land without permission, without any kind of clearance. And so the U.S.
dangerously effectively.
It was extremely dangerous because the aircraft carriers were full of aircraft. So the U.S. servicemen would haul the families out of the chopper, and then very quickly strip the chopper of any equipment that could be cannibalized and reused. I mean, they did this in a matter of minutes, and then they pushed the carcass of the chopper over the side into the sea, which
so was millions of dollars of equipment.
Millions and millions of dollars. And it was quite a metaphor for the war itself. Just seemed like a terrible waste of blood and treasure. I think the media played an enormous role in shaping public opinion. Why? Because they had extraordinary access. unprecedented access to the war itself. Any reporter who went to Vietnam could get an American reporter working for an American outlet, and I think foreign as well, would get a rank in the U.S. Army, say major, and would be allowed to go, could arrange himself or herself to go anywhere with any unit anywhere in the war zone. So you had this extraordinary coverage of the war, and which was never repeated really, because I think governments realized that if you let the media have unfettered access to what's happening, it may hurt you. But it meant
very exposing.
Well, yeah, exposing everything, and this is one of the extraordinary things about this series. The Film 72 has done an extraordinary job of going through all the footage that came out of that war. That's 1,100 hours of footage, not cut spots, but the rushes. They went through all of that from all sources, and then with that they put together these stories, these personal interest stories, very, very compelling stories of individuals, the ordinary individuals who were involved in the war. The conscript, or the nurse who goes in a hawk and she comes out, a supporter of the anti-war movement, or the officer who could have deferred the draft but felt guilty and signed up, and then had a terrible sort of epiphany, a moment of truth once there. I mean, they put these stories together through the series, which is a 6-part series, as you know, and it's absolutely compelling. It's I think profoundly moving, but not in a sort of saccharine sweet kind of way, and certainly not in a jingoistic kind of way. I think there was a general consensus that the war was unwinnable, and that it should never really have been. America should never really have become involved. Because of the TV coverage, I think the anti-war movement in the United States evolved very quickly. I mean, by 1967, you had big anti-war demonstrations in Washington, and the Americans sent in combat troops in 1965. So there was it became a huge anti-war movement that and it involved, there was the majority of American public opinion ended up very much against that war. So I think the other legacy perhaps is what happened to the vets from that war. It was enormously traumatic for ordinary guys. They're not educated guys, in many cases. It was the working class that got drafted into that war, and they come back and they're not treated as heroes. They're really sort of vilified, and many lived with that trauma and that stress. I mean, it was post-traumatic stress actually, and they lived with that, and I think many never really got over it. So I think one of the best outcomes in that sense was the building of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, where the names of every single American who served and died in Vietnam is engraved, embossed, carved into that shiny, high gloss granite slab. And I think that's has been a very important, extremely important thing to do, and to bring some kind of closure to those people, to those vets and their families.